The year was 1951, and the United States Navy had a serious problem. Pilots were dying at an alarming rate, not in combat, but during what should have been routine operations. The culprit was something that every naval aviator had to do regularly, landing on aircraft carriers. The statistics were grim and getting worse. For every 10,000 carrier landings, there were 40 crashes. That might not sound like much, but when you consider the thousands of landings happening every year, the numbers added up quickly. Young men were losing their lives, expensive aircraft were being destroyed, and nobody seemed to have a solution that actually worked. Aircraft carriers are perhaps the most challenging places on Earth to land an airplane. Imagine trying to land on a runway that is moving up and down with the ocean waves, pitching forward and backward and rolling side to side. Now imagine that this runway is only about 500 feet long, compared to the thousands of feet available at a regular airport. Add to this the fact that you are approaching at over 100 miles per hour, often in bad weather, sometimes at night, and frequently with low fuel after a long mission. The margin for error is almost zero. If you come in too high, you will miss the arresting wires that catch your plane and stop it. If you come in too low, you will crash into the back of the ship, which sailors grimly called the ramp. Either mistake could be fatal. The traditional method of carrier landings had been in place since the early days of naval aviation. A pilot would approach the carrier from behind, trying to judge the correct altitude and speed by looking at the deck and using their instincts. An officer called the landing signal officer, or LSO, would stand on the deck with colored paddles, giving the pilot signals about whether they were too high, too low, too fast, or too slow. The pilot had to watch both the deck and the LSO, judge the movement of the ship, control their speed and altitude, and somehow bring all these factors together for a safe landing. It was incredibly difficult and required exceptional skill, perfect timing, and no small amount of luck. The problem was that human perception is not very good at judging these things, especially under stress. When a pilot looked at the carrier deck approaching, their eyes and brain could play tricks on them. The phenomenon is called visual illusion, and it is particularly dangerous when landing on carriers. If the ship pitched upward just as the pilot was making final adjustments, it could make them think they were coming in too high, so they would lower the nose of the aircraft. But by the time they actually reached the deck, the ship might have pitched back down, meaning they were now dangerously low. Pilots were constantly making corrections based on misleading information, and these corrections often made things worse instead of better. Enter Lieutenant Commander John Thack, though the real breakthrough would come from someone else in the story we are about to tell. But first, we need to understand that the Navy knew they had a problem. They had tried various solutions. They improved training, giving pilots more practice time. They modified the carriers, adding better lighting and clearer deck markings. They upgraded the equipment in the aircraft, installing better instruments and more powerful engines. Nothing worked well enough. The crash rate stayed stubbornly high, and pilots kept dying. Then came a British Royal Navy officer named Captain Dennis Campbell. Actually, the breakthrough came from Lieutenant Commander H.C. Nicholas Goodhart, but the British Navy as a whole had been working on this problem too. The Royal Navy had an even worse problem than the Americans because their carriers were smaller and their approach speeds were higher. British pilots were dying at an even more alarming rate, and something had to change. What Goodhart proposed seemed absolutely crazy to experienced pilots. It went against everything they had been taught, everything they believed about how to fly an airplane, and especially everything they knew about carrier landings. Goodhart's idea was this. Instead of having pilots control both their altitude and their speed independently during the approach, they should control only one thing. The pilot would set the throttle to maintain a specific speed, and then they would use only the throttle to control their altitude. If they were too low, they would add power. If they were too high, they would reduce power. The control stick would be used only to maintain the correct speed and keep the wings level. This was completely backward from normal flying technique. In normal flying, pilots use the control stick to control altitude. You pull back on the stick to climb and push forward to descend. The throttle controls your speed. You add throttle to go faster and reduce it to go slower. This is how every pilot learned to fly from their very first lesson. It is intuitive and makes sense. Goodhart was proposing that pilots forget all of this training and do the opposite. Use the throttle for altitude and the stick for speed. To experienced aviators, this sounded insane. The concept actually had a scientific basis, though it was not immediately obvious. The key was something called angle of attack, which is the angle between the wing and the oncoming air. For any given aircraft at a given weight, there is an optimal angle of attack for landing. If you maintain this angle of attack and adjust your power, the aircraft will climb or descend while maintaining the same attitude and speed. This is much more stable and predictable than trying to adjust both altitude and speed separately using different controls. But there was more to Goodhart's revolutionary system than just the flying technique. He also proposed a completely new way of giving pilots information during their approach. Remember the landing signal officer with his colored paddles? Goodhart wanted to replace this human officer with a system of lights that would give the pilot precise information about whether they were on the correct glide path. This system became known as the mirror landing sight and later as the Fresnel lens optical landing system. Here is how it worked. A system of lights and lenses was set up on the side of the carrier deck. From the pilot's perspective, they would see a horizontal row of green reference lights called datum lights. In the middle of these datum lights, they would see an orange ball of light, which was actually a reflection from a curved mirror. If the pilot was on the correct glide path, the orange ball would appear to be lined up with the green datum lights. If the pilot was too high, the ball would appear above the datum lights. If they were too low, the ball would appear below the datum lights. The system was entirely optical and automatic. It did not depend on a human observer making judgment calls. The beauty of this system was that it gave the pilot clear, unambiguous information at a glance. They did not have to interpret hand signals or guess whether they were on the right path. The ball either was or was not aligned with the datum lights. Combined with the new throttle control approach technique, pilots now had both the information they needed and the method to act on it. If the ball was too high, reduce power slightly. If it was too low, add power slightly. Keep the ball on the datum lights all the way to touchdown. When the Royal Navy first tested this system in the early 1950s, the results were dramatic. Pilots who had been struggling with carrier landings suddenly found them much easier. The crash rate began to drop immediately. But there was still resistance, especially from experienced pilots who had mastered the old technique. They felt that the new method was too mechanical, that it took away the skill and artistry of carrier landing. Some even felt it was cowardly, as if real pilots should be able to land without technological help. The United States Navy heard about the British success and was interested but cautious. They sent observers to see the system in action and brought back favorable reports. But implementing a completely new landing system across the entire carrier fleet would be expensive and disruptive. There would need to be extensive testing, pilot retraining, and modifications to every carrier. The Navy bureaucracy moved slowly, as bureaucracies always do. Meanwhile, pilots continued to die using the old system. Finally, in 1955, the U.S. Navy began serious testing of the mirror landing system combined with the new approach technique. They set up the equipment on the U.S. of Bennington and began training pilots in the new method. The pilots selected for the initial trials were chosen carefully. They needed to be good enough to give the system a fair test, but not so set in their ways that they would reject it out of stubbornness. The training emphasized that this was not about replacing pilot skill with automation. The pilot was still making all the decisions and controlling the aircraft. The system was simply giving them better information and a more stable way to use it. The test results exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. Pilots using the new system were landing safely on their first or second attempt. Veterans who had hundreds of carrier landings under their belts reported that the new method was easier and less stressful. Most importantly, the crash rate dropped dramatically. Within a few years of full implementation across the fleet, the carrier landing crash rate had fallen from 40 crashes per 10,000 landings to fewer than 8 crashes per 10,000 landings. That was an 80% reduction. Hundreds of lives were being saved every year. Expensive aircraft were not being destroyed. Carriers could operate more efficiently because they were not constantly dealing with crashed aircraft on their decks. But the story does not end there. The success of this system taught the Navy some important lessons that went far beyond carrier landings. First, it showed that sometimes the best solution to a problem is not to make people better at a difficult task, but to change the task itself. The Navy had spent years trying to train pilots to be better at an almost impossible job. The real answer was to make the job easier by giving them better tools and techniques. Second, it demonstrated that challenging conventional wisdom can lead to breakthrough results. The idea of using throttle for altitude seemed crazy because it contradicted established practice, but it worked better precisely because it was different. The mirror landing system and the throttle-controlled approach technique are still in use today, though they have been updated with modern technology. Today's carriers use an improved version called the Fresnel lens optical landing system, which is more precise and visible in worse weather conditions. Pilots still learn the same basic technique that Goddard proposed 70 years ago. Use the throttle to maintain the correct glide path, use the stick to maintain the correct angle of attack and speed, and keep the ball centered on the datum lights. The fundamentals have not changed because they work so well. Modern naval aviation has added additional safety systems on top of this foundation. Today's carrier aircraft have sophisticated computers that help manage the approach. Some newer aircraft can even perform partially automated landings, though pilots are always in control and can take over at any moment. The carrier itself has better radar and communication systems to guide aircraft in bad weather or at night. But all of these modern improvements are built on the basic breakthrough that Goddard made: give pilots clear information and a stable, predictable way to use it. The impact of this innovation rippled beyond military aviation. The principles of the approach were studied by civilian aviation authorities and influenced the development of instrument landing systems at commercial airports. The idea that pilots should maintain a stable approach path and make small corrections rather than large maneuvers became standard practice across all types of aviation. Flight schools began teaching approach techniques that emphasized stability and small corrections over aggressive maneuvering. The core insight that precision comes from good information plus consistent technique became a foundation of modern flight training. There is also a human element to this story that is worth considering. Goddard's innovation saved lives, but it also changed the careers and experiences of thousands of pilots. Before the new system, carrier landings were so dangerous that they dominated a pilot's training and thinking. Pilots would be nervous for hours before a carrier landing, and the stress would affect their performance on missions. After the new system was implemented, pilots could focus more on their actual jobs, whether that was combat flying, reconnaissance, or other missions. Carrier landings became a routine part of the job rather than a constant life-threatening challenge. The story also highlights the importance of being willing to admit when something is not working and being open to radical solutions.